December 19, 1944. Luxembourg. Snow is falling in thick, heavy sheets, muffling sound and visibility across the frozen countryside. What had been assumed to be a quiet sector of the Western Front is now collapsing under the weight of the largest German offensive since Normandy. 2 days earlier, Adolf Hitler committed his last strategic reserves to a gamble through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The gamble is audacious, desperate, and initially devastating. American divisions are shattered, road networks are choked with refugees and retreating units, and Allied command is struggling to understand the true scale of what is unfolding. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, the mood has shifted from confidence to alarm. Maps are being redrawn by the hour as German spearheads punch deep into the American lines. Communications are unreliable, intelligence reports contradictory. No one can yet say whether this is a limited counterattack or something far worse. Eisenhower knows only one thing with certainty. If the German advance is not contained quickly, the entire Allied front in Western Europe is in jeopardy. The situation demands speed, but Allied doctrine, logistics, and command structures are not built for sudden improvisation on this scale. South of the Ardennes, George S. Patton's Third Army is facing east, driving steadily toward the Saar. His formations are spread across a wide front, fully engaged, their supply lines stretched but functioning. Patton has spent weeks arguing that the Germans are not finished, that they retain the capability and the will to strike back. His warnings were noted, filed, and largely discounted. Now, as reports of the German breakthrough pour in, those warnings take on an unsettling clarity. On the morning of December 19, Patton is summoned to a crisis meeting at Verdun. Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery's representatives, and senior staff officers gather around a table cluttered with maps, coffee cups, and hastily written situation reports. The atmosphere is tense, bordering on chaotic. Eisenhower outlines the problem plainly. German forces have broken through in the Ardennes, American units are falling back in disarray, and a counterstroke is needed to prevent disaster. The question is not whether to respond, but how quickly and with what forces. Patton listens carefully, saying little. When Eisenhower asks how long it would take Third Army to pivot north and attack the German flank, the room expects an answer measured in weeks. The maneuver being discussed is extreme. A 90-degree turn of an entire field army in winter conditions, over poor roads, while still in contact with the enemy. Conventional planning would require extensive preparation, detailed coordination, and explicit authorization at every level. Patton does not give a conventional answer. He says he can attack in 3 days. The room goes quiet. Some officers assume they have misheard. Others exchange skeptical glances. Eisenhower presses him, asking if he truly understands what is being proposed. Patton responds that he has already anticipated this possibility. Weeks earlier, against prevailing assumptions, he ordered his staff to draft contingency plans for a sudden German offensive through the Ardennes. While other commands focused on methodical advances and set-piece battles, Patton prepared for chaos. His units have movement tables, route plans, and logistical priorities already sketched out. The pivot, while risky, is not improvised. Eisenhower does not immediately grant permission. The stakes are enormous. If Patton fails, he could expose the southern Allied flank, disrupt ongoing operations, and worsen an already precarious situation. Allied command doctrine emphasizes coordination, consensus, and clear lines of authority. Acting too quickly, without full alignment, could be catastrophic. Yet waiting carries its own dangers. Every hour the Germans advance, their position strengthens. Patton leaves the meeting with no formal written order to attack, only a broad understanding that Eisenhower wants results and wants them fast. For many commanders, this ambiguity would be paralyzing. For Patton, it is sufficient. He interprets the intent rather than the wording. Speed, in his mind, is not just a tactical advantage. It is a moral imperative. Delay allows the enemy to recover, to entrench, to dictate the terms of battle. Within hours, Third Army Headquarters is in controlled chaos. Orders are issued, revised, and reissued as new intelligence arrives. Units are told to disengage, reroute, and move north through snow-covered roads clogged with traffic. Engineers work around the clock to keep bridges passable. Supply officers are forced to make impossible decisions about fuel allocation, knowing that tanks without gasoline are useless and trucks without fuel strand entire divisions. There is no time for perfect solutions. Every decision carries risk, and every risk carries consequences measured in lives. Patton does not wait for formal approval for every movement. He issues intent-driven orders, trusting his subordinate commanders to act aggressively within that framework. This approach runs counter to the more centralized control favored by other Allied leaders, particularly Montgomery. Where Montgomery seeks certainty before action, Patton accepts uncertainty as the natural condition of war. The question in his mind is not whether uncertainty exists, but whether it is exploited or endured. As Third Army begins its pivot, the human cost of speed becomes immediately apparent. Soldiers march and drive for days with little rest, in freezing temperatures, often without adequate winter clothing. Vehicles break down in the cold. Accidents increase as exhausted drivers navigate icy roads at night. Yet momentum builds. Units that should, by conventional estimates, take weeks to reposition are arriving in staging areas in days. German intelligence, already strained, fails to grasp the scale and speed of the movement until it is too late. By December 22, Patton's lead elements are in position to strike toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division is surrounded. The situation there is dire. Supplies are low, casualties mounting, and German forces are tightening the ring. The famous German demand for surrender has already been delivered and rejected. What happens next depends entirely on whether Patton's gamble pays off. The decision to move without explicit, step-by-step permission now reveals its full weight. If Third Army breaks through, Patton will be hailed as the commander who saved the Allied front. If it fails, he will bear responsibility for acting beyond the letter of his orders. This tension between initiative and obedience lies at the heart of modern command, and in December 1944, it is not an abstract debate. It is being tested in snow, blood, and steel. The relief of Bastogne is not immediate or easy. German resistance is fierce, and the terrain favors the defender. Yet Patton's pressure is relentless. Attacks go in day after day, probing for weakness, forcing German units to react rather than advance. This shift in momentum, subtle at first, becomes decisive. German commanders, already operating on thin margins, are forced to divert forces to meet the new threat, weakening their main effort. In the weeks that follow, the Ardennes offensive grinds to a halt. The German gamble fails, not because it lacked daring, but because it encountered a commander willing to move faster than the enemy could adapt. Patton's choice to prioritize speed over permission did not eliminate uncertainty or risk. It embraced them, channeling chaos into forward motion. Within Allied High Command, the episode sparks quiet reassessment. No official doctrine is rewritten, no public rebuke issued, but the lesson is absorbed. War, especially at the operational level, does not always allow for perfect coordination. Sometimes, decisive action depends on understanding intent rather than waiting for authorization. Patton's conduct in December 1944 becomes a case study in command initiative, cited, debated, and dissected long after the snow of the Ardennes has melted. The moment Patton chose speed over permission did not occur in isolation. It was the product of years of study, experience, and belief about the nature of modern warfare. It revealed how pressure forces commanders to choose between competing risks, how uncertainty rewards those willing to act, and how consequences, both triumphant and tragic, flow from decisions made without complete information. In World War II, as in all wars, history is shaped not only by plans approved, but by actions taken when time runs out. In the aftermath of the Ardennes fighting, the immediate danger recedes, but the implications of Patton's decision continue to ripple through Allied command structures. The battlefield has been stabilized, yet the price of speed is now being calculated in after-action reports, casualty lists, and logistical shortfalls. Third Army's rapid pivot consumed fuel and ammunition at a rate that alarmed supply officers, forcing emergency reallocations from other sectors. These adjustments succeed, but they expose how narrowly balanced the Allied advance has become by late 1944, dependent not only on industrial output, but on the judgment of individual commanders willing to strain the system. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower reviews reports detailing how close the operation came to failure. Whether delays nearly grounded air support entirely, road congestion slowed follow-on units, and several divisions arrived at the front with dangerously depleted strength. Yet Eisenhower also sees the alternative clearly. Had Patton waited for a perfectly worded directive or a fully synchronized plan, Bastogne would likely have fallen, and the German offensive would have gained precious time to consolidate. The choice was not between safety and recklessness, but between two different kinds of risk, each carrying consequences no planner could fully predict. This realization does not erase tensions within the Allied command. Montgomery, whose forces are now heavily engaged on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, continues to advocate for deliberate preparation and centralized control. He argues that Patton's success, while undeniable, relied on favorable circumstances and could not be safely replicated as standard practice. To Montgomery, war remains a problem to be solved through overwhelming force applied at the right moment, not through constant motion that courts exhaustion and disorder. The contrast between these philosophies sharpens as the Allies prepare for the final drive into Germany. Patton, for his part, remains unapologetic. In conversations with his staff, he frames the Ardennes pivot as proof that hesitation is the deadliest enemy in modern warfare. He points to German confusion, their inability to respond coherently once forced onto the defensive, as evidence that momentum itself can become a weapon. Yet even within Third Army, officers acknowledge the thin margin between success and disaster. They have seen units arrive just in time, bridges repaired hours before collapse, and supply columns rerouted moments before being cut off. As January 1945 unfolds, the Western Front transitions once more from crisis to advance. The Germans, having expended their last reserves, are now fighting a defensive war they cannot win. Allied command resumes broader coordination, but the memory of December lingers. Eisenhower begins to grant greater latitude to field commanders, issuing directives that emphasize objectives rather than detailed methods. This subtle shift reflects an understanding forged under pressure. That speed, when aligned with strategic intent, can compensate for incomplete information. The Ardennes episode also influences how Allied planners think about the coming operations across the Rhine. The question is no longer whether to move carefully or quickly, but how to balance the two without surrendering initiative. Patton continues to push his army hard, arguing that German resistance is brittle and must not be given time to recover. Each advance tests the limits of logistics, discipline, and endurance, reinforcing the lesson that operational success depends as much on judgment as on resources. Long after the guns fall silent, historians will debate whether Patton's choice in December 1944 represents genius or calculated gamble. What remains uncontested is that the decision forced Allied leadership to confront the realities of command under extreme pressure. War does not pause for approval cycles or committee consensus. It rewards those who act within the spirit of their mission when clarity is impossible and time is unforgiving. The moment Patton chose speed over permission thus becomes more than a dramatic episode in the Battle of the Bulge. It stands as an illustration of how World War II was fought at its most critical moments, by commanders navigating uncertainty, weighing imperfect options, and accepting responsibility for outcomes they could influence but never fully control. as the Allied armies move inexorably toward Germany's heartland. That lesson remains embedded in every order issued under the ticking clock of history. As February approaches, the Allied advance gathers renewed momentum, but the shadow of December's decisions continues to shape every operational discussion. Supply officers recalibrate their projections, factoring in the reality that future breakthroughs may again depend on sudden accelerations rather than carefully phased movements. The experience of the Ardennes has demonstrated that even the most robust logistical system can be bent, though not without consequence, when speed becomes the decisive variable. Fuel depots are repositioned closer to the front, bridging units are kept on near-constant alert, and staff planners quietly acknowledge that flexibility has become as vital as precision. Within Third Army, Patton reinforces the culture that carried his forces through the crisis. Commanders are encouraged to act aggressively, to exploit gaps without waiting for confirmation that may never arrive in time. Yet this aggressiveness is tempered by hard-earned caution. After-action analyses circulate through headquarters, detailing moments when units nearly outran their support or exposed their flanks. These documents are not written to restrain initiative, but to sharpen it, reminding officers that speed must be paired with constant situational awareness. At the same time, Eisenhower faces the broader challenge of maintaining coalition unity. British and American commanders interpret the Ardennes differently, each drawing lessons that align with their pre-war doctrines and wartime experiences. Eisenhower's role becomes one of balance, ensuring that boldness does not fracture coordination while preventing excessive caution from dulling the Allied edge. His leadership increasingly reflects an understanding that effective command lies not in rigid control, but in setting clear intent and trusting subordinates to act within it. As the Rhine looms ahead, intelligence reports indicate that German forces are struggling to reconstitute coherent defensive lines. The enemy's capacity to respond to rapid advances has been eroded by losses, fuel shortages, and the psychological impact of repeated encirclements. Patton interprets this as confirmation of his beliefs, arguing that relentless pressure will prevent the Germans from ever regaining equilibrium. Each successful crossing, each town seized ahead of schedule, reinforces the perception that momentum itself is shaping the battlefield. Yet the human cost remains ever present. Units that have marched and fought continuously since Normandy show signs of fatigue, and replacements often arrive with minimal training. Commanders must weigh the temptation to press forward against the risk of pushing exhausted formations beyond their limits. The choices they make echo the same dilemma faced in December: when to slow down, and when delay is more dangerous than haste. By early March 1945, Allied operations reflect a synthesis born of necessity. Plans outline objectives with built-in flexibility, allowing commanders to accelerate or pause as conditions dictate. The rigid timetables of earlier campaigns give way to rolling assessments, updated daily, sometimes hourly. This adaptive approach owes much to the precedent set when Patton acted first and sought permission later, forcing the entire command structure to confront the realities of modern, fast-moving war. The legacy of that moment is not confined to Patton alone. It reshapes how Allied leaders understand authority, responsibility, and risk. Decisions made at the front are no longer seen merely as deviations from plan, but as potential engines of success when aligned with strategic purpose. In this environment, the line between audacity and recklessness is drawn not by doctrine, but by results measured under fire. As Allied forces prepare to breach Germany's final natural defenses, the lesson endures that victory in World War II has depended on commanders willing to act amid uncertainty. The choice to prioritize speed over permission was not an isolated gamble, but part of a broader evolution in how the war was fought and won. Each advance now carries forward that understanding, as the Western Allies move closer to an end shaped as much by decisive moments as by carefully laid plans. As spring settles over the European theater, the tempo of operations accelerates once more, driven by the same imperatives that have governed the campaign since Normandy. Deny the enemy time, deny him coherence, and deny him the chance to choose where to fight. The experience of the winter has hardened Allied commanders to the reality that pauses invite resistance. Every delay gives German staff officers another night to redraw maps, reposition guns, and stiffen collapsing fronts. Speed, even when imperfect, has become the Allies' most reliable weapon. At Third Army headquarters, operational maps change so rapidly that clerks struggle to keep unit markers current. Advances planned in days are executed in hours. Armored columns push through towns before rear area security units have fully arrived, while infantry divisions follow in forced marches to secure ground already taken in principle. This creates moments of dangerous exposure, but Patton accepts them as the price of initiative. He understands that the German command system, already fractured by Allied air power and fuel shortages, cannot react coherently if pressure is maintained everywhere at once. German commanders, reading fragmentary reports and intercepted radio traffic, begin to recognize the pattern too late. They see not a single decisive thrust, but a series of rapid, overlapping advances that make it impossible to determine where the true Schwerpunkt lies. Attempts to assemble armored reserves falter when units arrive piecemeal, low on fuel, and are immediately forced into defensive action. What remains of German operational flexibility is consumed simply trying to survive the next 48 hours. Air power amplifies these effects. Allied fighter bombers roam freely over roads and rail lines, turning any daylight movement into a gamble. Columns that attempt to reposition are broken up before they can mass, while supply convoys are destroyed faster than they can be replaced. The interaction between ground speed and air dominance creates a feedback loop. Rapid advances force German movement, and movement exposes them to destruction from the air. This convergence of tanks, aircraft, and maneuver doctrine defines the final phase of the campaign in the West. Within Allied high command, the success of these operations forces a quiet reassessment of long-held assumptions. Staff studies circulate examining how decentralized decision-making, when guided by clear strategic intent, has produced results that no detailed pre-war plan could have predicted. Eisenhower does not attempt to impose uniformity where it no longer fits reality. Instead, he focuses on maintaining alignment, ensuring that aggressive thrusts serve the broader objective of collapsing German resistance, rather than pursuing glory or geographic milestones. The pressure on German civilian populations increases as the front races eastward. Towns change hands with little warning, sometimes spared destruction precisely because resistance collapses before fighting can develop. In other areas, desperation leads to brief but violent clashes, exacting a toll on soldiers and civilians alike. These encounters underscore the consequences of speed, when battles are decided quickly. Suffering can be limited, but when resistance hardens unexpectedly, losses mount just as fast. By the time Allied units reach the approaches to the Rhine, the campaign has taken on an air of inevitability, though commanders are careful not to confuse momentum with invulnerability. Rivers still present natural obstacles, and German forces, though weakened, remain capable of inflicting sharp blows. Yet the psychological balance has shifted irreversibly. German officers speak increasingly of delay rather than defense, of survival rather than victory. The doctrine emerging from these weeks is not written down in manuals, but it is understood across the front. Act decisively when opportunity appears, accept calculated risk, and trust subordinate leaders to translate intent into action under fire. This understanding traces directly back to moments when commanders chose motion over hesitation, redefining what was possible in modern war. As operations continue eastward, the Allied advance becomes less about single dramatic breakthroughs and more about sustained pressure applied everywhere simultaneously. The war's end is no longer imagined as a single decisive battle, but as the cumulative effect of countless decisions made under stress, each favoring momentum over delay. In that sense, the choice of speed over permission continues to echo through every headquarters and every column on the road, shaping the final months of the conflict without ever being formally declared as doctrine.